Laura Jean Akerson lived for her sons. She was a devoted mother, a businesswoman, and someone who kept everything under tight control. But even her meticulous attention and strict routines couldn't shield her from a nightmare. A seemingly ordinary Friday meeting with her ex-husband spiraled into a disappearance that would soon reveal a horrifying plot. Laura Jean Akerson lived in Kinston, North Carolina. She was 27, raising 2 young boys and balancing motherhood with a job. Laura aimed to give them the maximum care and attention, carefully scheduling every moment of her day. With her friend Yabanis, she founded a small enterprise, handling client outreach, drafting proposals, and overseeing project execution. Yabanis remarked on Laura's ability to stay calm and focused even under severe pressure. Laura's home was arranged with children's safety in mind. Toys were neatly stored, furniture placed according to their needs, and groceries chosen with great care. Each evening, she read to her sons and kept detailed notes on their growth. What the older one ate, new skills of the younger, what items needed to be purchased. Those notes weren't for show. They were precious records of their lives together. Her planner had 2 kinds of tasks, professional and family. Her rigorous business schedules and financial projections sat beside reminders about school parties, children's clothes, and needed supplies. She weighed every decision very deliberately, always remembering her son's well-being. Akerson wasn't chasing fame or big achievements. Her priority was different, to give her children a stable, peaceful life. She found joy in daily routines, in the predictable, and envisioned the future only through their happiness. Laura Jean Akerson had moved back to North Carolina because one of her sons had health issues. After living in the U.S. Virgin Islands, she relocated to the Raleigh area and then settled in Kinston so she could access medical care and maintain a steady routine for both boys. All her decisions were made with medical needs and logistics in mind. Access to clinics, appointment scheduling, and ensuring medications were taken properly. By this time, her relationship with Grant Ruffin Hayes was essentially over. Their communication was limited to matters concerning the children, scheduling, location, and duration of visits. Emotional debates were off the table. Laura documented all their agreements in writing to eliminate ambiguity. She stressed that medical recommendations and school routines had to be prioritized, and she demanded exactness in reporting the children's well-being. At the same time, Grant had moved on and remarried. He and Amanda Perry Hayes tied the knot in Las Vegas and soon welcomed a child of their own. They later relocated to the Raleigh area, saying they wanted to be closer to Grant's sons. While this move gave him more access to his children, it also created more situations that demanded coordination and more chances for disagreements. Who would pick up the kids? Where would the handoff happen? Who had the final say on doctor visits and vaccinations? What started as a strained relationship over custody soon escalated into a legal battle. The court stepped in and laid out a clear visitation schedule, specific days, set hours, and drop-offs at a neutral location. Any changes had to be agreed upon in advance and put in writing. Each handoff included a checklist, items the boys needed, and notes on their daily routine. Still, even with the court's guidelines in place, the arguments didn't stop. Grant, Ruffin Hayes, kept pushing for changes outside the agreement. Different times, different meeting spots, longer visits. The court required that all communication be limited to child-related matters, short messages, written only, with no room for personal disputes. Any request to modify the schedule had to be backed by a clear, valid reason. Friday exchanges became something of a ritual, strict and structured. Arrival times were tracked, missing items were logged and sent along the next week. If Grant tried to change the neutral drop-off point to a private location, it was treated as a violation of the court order. Akerson made it clear that the rules were there to reduce risk and avoid confusion. The emotional tension was building. As disagreements deepened, both sides leaned harder on legal language. Every argument became a reference to court orders. as stated in the agreement, within the designated window, per the established arrangement. The very rules that were meant to create stability were turning into weapons in a battle of interpretations. By midsummer, things were near a breaking point. Even small issues, where to park, how to hand over belongings, confirmation of receipt, became matters requiring negotiation. And although the Friday routine and neutral meeting site were still being followed, each week brought new friction. It was in this tense atmosphere that events were set in motion, events that would change everything. On July 13th, Laura Jean Akerson was preparing for an evening with her children under the court-ordered visitation schedule. But this time, something was different. Instead of meeting at the usual neutral drop-off point, the plan was to go to Grant Ruffin Hayes' apartment. Every detail, from the time to the route, had been arranged in advance. Before leaving, Laura went through her routine with precision. She double-checked that she had her son's necessary medications, a change of clothes, their doctor's contact information, and small personal items they might need. She kept documents and keys in a separate pouch so she could find them quickly. Her phone was fully charged, notifications were on, and she had built in extra time for parking and traffic to make sure she arrived on time. Meeting at the apartment was a one-time exception to the established rules. That meant every aspect had to be planned. The exact address, the timing, even how the children's belongings would be transferred. All of it was coordinated in advance to prevent last-minute changes or improvisations. Before heading out, Laura checked off 2 last reminders in her planner: verify the children's car seats and, after the visit, send a status update to her friend. She was determined to follow the schedule exactly, without unauthorized changes or extensions. For her, sticking to agreements was non-negotiable. That evening, Laura set out, phone within reach for quick confirmations. The last known messages she sent, time-stamped at 4:19 p.m. on July 13th, included a promise to check in later, possibly by 7 p.m. After that, no further voice messages came through. The meeting she had planned later with her friend Yabanis never happened, and there was no confirming call. In reality, all communication stopped after the arrangements for the apartment visit. These details mark the time window of her last known movements and form the starting point for the timeline of events. After that scheduled meeting, Laura Jean Akerson vanished. Her friend Yabanis tried repeatedly to reach her, something highly unusual, since Laura was known for always updating people on her plans. By nightfall, concern turned into alarm. The next morning, Yabanis tried again. She checked Laura's messaging apps and email for activity. Nothing new appeared. No new voice messages had been left. By midday, she filed a missing person report with the Kinston Police Department. The last known destination Laura had been headed to was a meeting connected to her children. The initial search of Laura's apartment and vehicle didn't show any signs of forced entry or a rushed departure. Her phone was silent, location tracking was off, and there were no unusual banking transactions. These details raised red flags, prompting Raleigh detectives Jerry Fulk and Brian Hall to formally join the investigation, especially since Laura's last known contact occurred within their jurisdiction. Investigators began by interviewing Laura's close friend, Yabanis. They asked for essential background: Laura's usual routes, the doctors she took her sons to, locations and times of recent visits, and anyone she had interacted with in the days leading up to her disappearance. They also requested access to her voice messages and phone records. Yabanis provided the contact numbers Laura used most often for both personal and business matters, and confirmed that she had been expecting a call from Laura that never came. The detectives started piecing together the day Laura went missing by speaking with those closest to her. At the same time, they reached out to Raleigh authorities for information on where Grant Ruffin Hayes lived, since Laura's final plans had involved her children and a visit connected to Grant. Early in the investigation, a man named Mike came forward. Laura had been in contact with him recently, both professionally and personally. After learning about her disappearance, Mike contacted police himself and offered to help distribute flyers. While his willingness to help could have been genuine concern, the detectives, drawing on their experience, viewed his actions with caution. People sometimes insert themselves into investigations for reasons beyond helping. Mike was flagged for a more thorough background check and added to the list of individuals requiring closer scrutiny. Meanwhile, police pulled footage from surveillance cameras along Laura's usual Friday routes. Some Raleigh neighbors responded, saying they had seen cars near Grant's home that evening. The timing matched what was expected. These accounts were logged as preliminary data and would need to be confirmed through Laura's phone records. With these developments, the case was officially upgraded from a welfare check to an active missing person investigation. In the detective's case, log, 2 primary leads were marked in red: Inner Circle, which included her former partner and his associates, and new contacts, with Mike now included in that list. The first person authorities questioned after Laura's disappearance was Mike. His interview was conducted immediately. Mike told investigators that his relationship with Laura had been casual, a few meetings in the past, followed by mostly professional correspondence. He admitted he had hoped to stay in touch, but Laura had declined due to ongoing custody issues. This statement aligned with what her friend had already shared. With Mike's consent, detectives copied data from his phone and computer for forensic analysis. Their goal was to reconstruct the history of calls, texts, and emails, recover any deleted data, and compare timestamps to the day Laura went missing. The results showed nothing unusual. Sparse work-related messages, no arguments, and normal activity during business hours. They also examined geolocation data from his devices. During the time frame when Laura was believed to be traveling to meet her children, Mike's devices were located nowhere near her route. There was no overlap in their movements. Mike's alibi was further backed up by third-party evidence, access logs at his workplace, banking transactions, and footage from security cameras. Together, these confirmed he was in a completely different location during the critical window, ruling out his physical presence near any scene of interest. The digital exchange between Mike and Laura showed no signs of pressure, threats, or attempts to coerce a meeting on the day she disappeared. In fact, the messages reflected restraint and respect for the boundaries Laura had set. No communication occurred during the day before her final known contact. Taking into account the totality of the evidence, alibi, digital trails, and external confirmations, Mike was cleared as a primary suspect. His status was officially changed to verified individual, meaning future involvement would be on an as-needed basis. With that lead closed, the investigation naturally shifted toward Grant Ruffin Hayes. The new contact's angle had run its course, and the focus moved to the inner circle. In his initial interview, Grant Ruffin Hayes gave his version of what happened on July 13th. According to him, Laura Jean Akerson arrived at his home around 6:30 p.m. to pick up the children for a few hours. He claimed that around 9:30 p.m. she brought them back and left before 10. Grant described the home visit as a one-time arrangement. Detectives asked for proof of this account. When questioned about why the child exchange hadn't taken place at the neutral location required by their custody agreement, Grant said, "It was just more convenient." But he couldn't produce any written consent or messages from Laura to support that claim. When pressed about witnesses who might have seen Laura that night, Grant named only himself and Amanda Perry Hayes. There were no others. Next came the excuse of poor signal. Grant Hayes claimed he had been out of town, which, according to him, made it difficult to answer calls or respond promptly. But that didn't add up. He was living in Raleigh, and the custody exchange was supposed to follow a court-approved schedule, one where unreliable communication wasn't an acceptable issue when it came to the care of children. When asked to clarify exactly where this spotty signal had occurred, Grant gave vague answers. Somewhere outside the city, without providing any real address or landmarks. Then there were inconsistencies in his timeline. Initially, he said Laura arrived around 6:30 p.m. and left sometime around 9:30. But in a follow-up version, those time frames shifted by 10 to 15 minutes. He explained the change by saying he wasn't keeping track to the minute. But in custody arrangements, exact timing matters, and detectives needed to know when, precisely, the children were dropped off and picked up. Grant couldn't give a straight answer. The question came up: why deviate from the court-mandated neutral location just this once? Grant insisted it was Laura's idea, but when investigators reviewed the messages he provided, they found no direct request from Laura to meet at his apartment. That absence of proof was documented as a lack of supporting evidence for his claim. There were also conflicting accounts about what happened after the exchange. Grant said everything was wrapped up by 9:30 and that there was no reason for further contact. But investigators already knew that Laura had told a friend she planned to check in later that night. He had no explanation for why she never followed up. When asked about his exact whereabouts between 7 and 10 p.m., Hayes was evasive, saying things like, "I was home," and "I was with the kids." But that contradicted his earlier statement that the children had been with Laura during that time. Questions about who was caring for Amanda's child, who opened the door, who handed over the kids' belongings, these all led to more contradictions. His version of events kept shifting. Noticing these inconsistencies, investigators began cross-checking his story using external data, phone logs, GPS records, travel routes, and efforts to locate additional witnesses. That's when the phone records gave investigators their first breakthrough. Grant Ruffin Hayes' phone showed a clear westward movement from Raleigh, tracking across Alabama and Mississippi, eventually connecting with highways leading into Texas. The steady ping trail suggested a long, uninterrupted drive. Amanda Perry Hayes' devices followed a near-identical route, confirming they were traveling together. Matching this phone activity with banking transactions and Wi-Fi connections along the route revealed an uninterrupted trail that began shortly after Laura Jean Akerson disappeared. The route had no usual detours. It was direct, focused, and led straight to Fort Bend County, Texas. Key information came from Amanda's stepdaughter, Shay Elmer, who told investigators that her mother was currently in Texas. Shay didn't know the reason for the trip, only that it seemed sudden and unexpected. That tip led authorities to look into Amanda's relatives, specifically her sister, Karen Barry, who lived in Fort Bend. When detectives arrived at Karen Barry's home, they learned that Grant and Amanda had shown up without notice. No heads up, no explanation. During the first 24 hours, they were visibly tense and often away from the house. Karen noted something else unusual. Grant had taken a strong interest in the property's outbuildings, especially the pig pen. He asked about private access to work with chemicals and inquired about spots where he could launch a boat without being seen. There were also strange questions about the local environment. Grant wanted to know if there were alligators in the nearby waters and how dangerous it might be to approach the shoreline around dusk. To detectives, this was highly suspicious. The visitors had no clear, personal or vacation-related reason to be in the area, and yet their immediate curiosity centered on nature and access to water. Investigators inspected Karen's property. There was indeed a pig pen and a utility area used for feeding livestock and storing tools. Karen recalled seeing Grant alone near these buildings more than once, not doing anything specific, just wandering, and said she noticed a strong smell of household chemicals coming from him. She couldn't pinpoint the exact time, but said it happened within the first 2 days after they arrived. Meanwhile, the digital forensics team continued analyzing cell phone data. They picked up brief pings from both Grant and Amanda's phones near water inlets around Fort Bend County. These timestamps matched the periods when Karen said they were away from her home. Additional records showed quick stops at hardware stores along the route to Fort Bend. While exact items purchased were still being confirmed, there had been enough time to pick up supplies. A follow-up interview with Shay Elmer provided more clarity. She had only learned about the trip after it happened. There hadn't been any urgent family issue to justify the sudden travel. In their texts, Amanda had been evasive, offering no details about where they were going or why. That cast serious doubt on the spur-of-the-moment visit explanation. No family reason, no logistical paper trail. Based on the evidence, investigators formed a working theory. Grant and Amanda left North Carolina shortly after Laura's last known communication and drove straight to Karen Barry's residence. Once there, their behavior quickly shifted to scouting locations where traces could be concealed. Though their ultimate goal was still unclear, the investigation narrowed in on Fort Bend County, specifically the outbuildings and the nearby bodies of water. Local authorities in Fort Bend brought in an environmental crimes investigator. He focused on known areas where illegal dumping had occurred in the past. At one of those sites, signs of recent contamination were discovered. The soil had changed color, and there was a noticeable chemical odor. On Karen Barry's property, near the structures where Grant had spent time, particularly around the pig pen, soil samples were taken. Lab tests confirmed the presence of hydrochloric acid. The results showed a sharp drop in pH levels, a high concentration of chloride ions, and erosion of the carbonate layer in the topsoil, clear indicators of corrosive chemical exposure. At the same time, investigators reviewed footage from concealed trail cameras placed in a wooded area known for suspicious activity. The video showed Amanda Perry Hayes unloading containers labeled hydrochloric acid from the bed of a pickup truck registered to Karen Barry's son. Grant Hayes wasn't visible in the footage. Amanda's actions were methodical, unloading the canisters, carrying them deeper into the woods, and leaving them at the tree line. The timestamps matched the period she had been away from her sister's home. Back at the pig pen, detectives found a second source of confirmation. A patch of discolored soil caught the investigators' attention, a possible sign of a recent chemical spill. Soil samples were taken in layers. Nearby, in a shallow ditch, plastic fragments were recovered that matched the texture and thickness of household chemical containers. Forensic chemists concluded that while the concentrations used wouldn't fully break down organic matter under normal conditions, the chemical residues in the soil were unmistakable. Investigators also cross-referenced local hardware store transactions with footage from nearby traffic cameras. Based on purchase times and mileage, they believed cleaning chemicals had been bought during the trip, but they couldn't definitively link those purchases to the exact containers in the woods. Receipts didn't have names, and the traffic cameras only captured silhouettes and the truck's license plate. To examine the remains recovered from the river, the team brought in Dr. Ann Ross, a forensic anthropology expert. Her role was to identify the bones, determine whether they belonged to one person or multiple individuals, and document any trauma, whether it happened during life, shortly before death, or afterward. The material arrived in segments, ribs, vertebrae, and pieces of long bones. There was no remaining soft tissue. The first stage was inventory. Dr. Ross noted clean, straight edges on several fragments, a sign of mechanical alteration. The cuts were parallel, with visible scoring from repeated contact with a serrated blade, strong evidence that a saw had been used. In contrast, breaks caused by natural forces usually result in jagged, irregular patterns. Here, the cuts were smooth, showing a slight micro-ridge, typical of blade exit points. Next came microscopic analysis. Under a stereo microscope, she documented longitudinal striations along the cut surfaces, measured the width of the saw blade, and assessed small spurs caused by the blade slipping, as well as any false starts. On the ribs and some vertebrae, Dr. Ross observed multiple parallel grooves aligned in the same direction, consistent with the motion of a saw. The third phase focused on functional interpretation. The placement of the clean cuts indicated that the limbs and head had been intentionally removed from the torso. Cuts were located at joints and areas of bone that are anatomically easier to disarticulate. On the neck, crosswise marks made by a serrated blade were clearly visible. The angle of entry and the depth of these cuts pointed to deliberate sawing, not blunt trauma. There were no signs of healing, which confirmed that the dismemberment occurred either immediately before or after death. The fourth phase was a preliminary assessment of the instrument used. The shape of the cuts and the microscopic traces on the bone suggested that a saw had been involved. Based on the number of blade passes and the consistency of the marks, it was evident the cuts were confident and intentional. This supported two main possibilities: either a hand saw with widely spaced teeth or a powered reciprocating saw. From the current fragment set, it was impossible to determine the exact type. A reference comparison would be needed to narrow it down further. An added challenge came from the initial processing of the remains. Before Dr. Ross received the fragments, some had already been sectioned during an earlier examination in Texas. That meant each clean cut had to be evaluated to determine its origin, whether it was trauma-related or made during technical examination. To differentiate, the team used cut mapping, depth analysis, and directional blade patterning. The fifth phase was the conclusion on the act of dismemberment. The collective evidence indicated that the disarticulation occurred after death or during the perimortem window. The limbs and head had been intentionally removed. While this didn't reveal the cause of death, it painted a clearer picture of the actions taken post-mortem and helped investigators determine the kind of tool used and how it may have been handled. From Texas, a new piece of evidence arrived: a femur believed to belong to Laura Jean Akerson. This fragment became a high priority because of its dense structure, which allowed for clearer detection of tool marks. Initial analysis included measurements of the bone's length, thickness, and diameter, followed by close-up imaging of the ends where cutting had occurred. Examination of the cross-section revealed irregularities, such as false starts and blade spurs at the exit, all consistent with a reciprocating saw. To confirm the findings, Dr. Ross performed a controlled comparison. With approval from law enforcement, she acquired a powered reciprocating saw and two types of blades, a universal one and one made for wood. Pig bones of similar size were used for test cuts. The universal blade used in testing produced a different pattern of striations and a wider kerf. The micro-texture on the cut surface didn't match the marks found on the femur. Next, the team tested a wood-cutting blade with fewer teeth per inch. The results aligned closely with the femur's markings. The width of the cut fell within the margin of error. The frequency and depth of the linear grooves matched, as did the shape of the exit spur and the characteristics of the false starts at the beginning of each cut. These comparative images were included in the final report as a match based on a combination of identifying features. While the femur analysis continued, the lab received a cervical vertebra with a localized linear injury on its surface. Microscopic examination revealed a narrow groove with fine serrations along the edges, positioned perpendicular to the axis of the vertebra. This mark was different from the broader cuts left by the saw. It showed a wedge-shaped intrusion with delicate serrated edges, indicating contact with a sharp object that had a toothed cutting edge. The location of the injury, just below the jawline, in the area corresponding to the soft tissues of the neck, led to a significant conclusion. This wound had likely been inflicted near the time of death with a sharp serrated instrument. The nature of the trauma supported the theory of a sharp force injury to the neck. In her report, Dr. Ross distinguished two distinct types of trauma: A, saw marks found on the femur and other skeletal fragments indicating that the body was dismembered after death. B, a sharp force injury on the cervical vertebra, which, in her expert opinion, was the likely cause of death. The first category pointed to an attempt to conceal the body, while the second was identified as the probable fatal wound. The official language recommended for legal documentation stated, "Findings from the forensic anthropological analysis are consistent with death, resulting from a neck wound," followed by post-mortem or perimortem dismemberment investigators, then reconstructed the events using data from electronic devices, witness interviews, and forensic reports. Inside the apartment of Grant Ruffin Hayes, Laura Jean Akerson was coerced into writing a fraudulent document. labeled a custody agreement. Handwriting analysis confirmed that the top section had been written by Grant, while the lower portion was completed by Laura. The document appeared designed to simulate voluntary consent and provide a form of alibi for what would happen next. The confrontation, believed to have taken place in or near the kitchen or dining area, escalated into physical violence. Laura sustained a sharp force injury to the neck, likely the fatal wound. Following her death, Grant and Amanda Hayes moved Laura's body to the bathroom, where they dismembered it in what appeared to be an attempt to conceal the crime. The scene was then meticulously cleaned and disinfected. The remains were packed into containers, likely coolers, and transported across state lines to Fort Bend County, Texas, in an effort to dispose of the evidence. Initially, the Hayeses attempted to dissolve the remains using hydrochloric acid, but they quickly realized the process was far slower than they had anticipated. Frustrated by the lack of results, they rented a boat, navigated a nearby river, and discarded the containers overboard, believing, it seems, that the wildlife would handle the rest. Later, human remains were discovered in a remote channel of the river. The recovery of these parts closed the investigative loop, from the apartment to the dismemberment, to transport across state lines, and finally, to a body of water. Investigators found strong evidence of coordination between Grant and Amanda. Despite later attempts to shift blame during questioning, independent sources confirmed the sequence of events. Their cooperation in planning and execution was undeniable. The trial of Grant Ruffin Hayes began in the summer of 2013. Prosecutors presented a tightly woven narrative. Deviation from the court-ordered child exchange location, the one-time visit to Grant's apartment, the sudden disappearance of Laura Jean Akerson, the tracked movement of both Grant and Amanda's phones across several states, and the purchase of tools and chemicals later used in the attempted concealment. At the heart of the prosecution's case was the forensic report by Dr. Ann Ross. The defense tried to create distance between the two defendants and to cast doubt on the source of the injuries. Attorneys argued that the dismemberment could have occurred post-mortem at the hands of a third party, and that the trip to Texas was nothing more than a spontaneous family road trip. During cross-examination, they emphasized the absence of perfect biological evidence in the bathroom. One of the most pivotal moments in court came during Dr. Ross's expert testimony, calm, clear, and clinical. Her presentation was methodical, leaving little room for speculation. Then, the prosecution played an audio recording. It was a track Grant had written and performed himself, one in which he made graphic threats of violence toward Laura. The courtroom noted his reaction, and it did not help his case. The recording became a turning point, reinforcing the narrative of intent and premeditation. The jury was convinced this was not a spontaneous act, but a calculated and deliberate crime. The verdict for Grant Ruffin Hayes, guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. Amanda Perry Hayes was tried separately in 2014. The prosecution focused on her independent actions throughout the case, while the defense tried to shift the blame onto Grant, portraying Amanda as someone acting under pressure or coercion. Investigators presented detailed timelines showing multiple moments where she acted alone, without immediate influence or threat. The court, after clearly defining the roles, found Amanda Perry Hayes guilty of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to between 13 and 16 years in prison. The judge noted that her actions were essential to covering up the crime, and that she was far from a passive participant. The court acknowledged the lasting, devastating impact on the families involved. Laura's two sons were left without a mother, and, effectively, without a father. Meanwhile, Grant and Amanda's infant child had to be placed under the care of others, beginning a new chapter shaped by decisions from child services and extended family. During closing statements, the prosecution highlighted the crucial role of forensic experts. Dr. Ann Ross's testimony, framed as her professional responsibility to speak for those who no longer can, became a pivotal moment in the trial. It was her meticulous, evidence-backed analysis that helped the court separate fact from fiction and ultimately deliver justice through two measured, appropriate sentences. Thanks for watching, everyone. Your support means a lot to me, and you can help my channel grow by hitting that like button, dropping a comment, and sharing this video. Your engagement really makes a difference. See you soon.